In early American history, we've learned that there were two major centers of English colonization. One was in Virginia, in what we would refer to as the South, and one was in New England. We call that the North. If you look on a map, Virginia is here, and New England is here. And these two different settlements had two very different economies or ways of keeping themselves alive. In the South, they largely depended upon what were referred to as cash crops, things they could sell. And the best cash crop at that time, of course, was tobacco. Eventually, they would add things like indigo and cotton and rice. But the main cash crop in Virginia was tobacco. Now, those who came to settle in New England, they weren't interested in becoming rich, wealthy planters. These were, by and large, religious Puritans who wanted to have a simple family and worship God and survive to the next day. And so what they did was what we call subsistence farming. They grew some tomatoes and they had some hogs and some chickens, just enough to keep their family going. Which of those two economies, though, would require the largest labor force? Cash crops, obviously. If you're trying to grow a lot of crops so that you can sell them overseas so that you can make a lot of money, you need a large labor force. If you're having a little subsistence farm and you got 10 kids, you kind of have your labor force there for you. So in the South, primarily, not exclusively, but in the South, there was a need for labor. Now, there were three potential markets, as it were, human markets for laborers. The first was the Indian population. But it was very difficult to enslave Indians, a number of reasons. It was their land, for one. Their families were nearby. If they were enslaved, they could easily be rescued. They could escape much more easily. So the attempt to enslave the Indians pretty much failed rather early on after European settlement. The second thought was, well, what we can do is bringing people from England who don't have the wherewithal to pay for their passage. We'll pay for their passage if they give us 7 years of servitude. This is what we would call an indentured servant, and many of the first English people, Europeans, to come to America came as indentured servants. But then again, after 7 years, they're gone, and you need a new group of laborers. The indentured servitude program eventually kind of fell apart, largely because of the third labor market, which was the African labor market. The Southerners realized that African slaves worked out quite well for a number of reasons. They couldn't escape. Very hard to get from Virginia back to Africa. They stood out. You see, an indentured servant, if they escape, somebody says, "Are you a slave or an indentured servant?" You could just say, "Are you an indentured servant or are you a freeman?" "I'm a freeman." Well, who knows? But a African who is by nature a slave, his skin color kind of gives him away in the attempt that he or she tries to escape. Also, Africans were quite acclimated to heat. They lived along the equator. They farmed and they worked in very hot temperatures, so they were able to labor in the summertime in the heat. And in fact, their community was fractured. They couldn't count on their uncles and aunts in Africa coming to rescue them the way that the Native Americans, could. The slave trade was an economic system whereby the people who owned boats and whatnot would prosper by bringing slaves from Africa to America. The first nation to really get into this business were the Dutch. And what they developed was basically a triangle whereby you would sell certain goods to Europe, and then Europe would send their slavers to Africa, and then we'd have what's called the Middle Passage from Africa to America, which was the part of the triangle where the slaves were being transported. And the most vicious, the most deadly, the most awful part of the slave trade was what's known as the Middle Passage. But the slave trade was quite profitable. If you were willing to be ruthless, if you were willing to deal with the horrors of death and sickness and the imprisonment of human beings, you could make a lot of money. and certainly a lot of people did that kind of thing. Now, once a slave came to America, that wouldn't necessarily be the end of that particular slave's ability to create more slaves. Namely, we have the domestic created or born slaves, and that is the children of slaves were automatically, according to the laws of the southern colonies, were automatically slaves themselves. So why is it that these people believed that it was proper to enslave other human beings? Well, one was history. Throughout the history of humankind, going back to Rome and Greece and certainly Egypt, we know about the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. There had been slaves in just about every place, in just about every time. The idea of not having slavery was actually quite the minority opinion in the 1600s. The Bible even mentions slaves. There are certain passages in the New Testament, in the book of Peter, that says, slaves, obey your masters. If you are enslaved, don't seek to be free. And Peter says, don't only obey the nice masters, but also slaves obey harsh masters. And in doing so, you show your Christianity and your humility. The other piece is cultural. It was something that was accepted. I don't sense that the people who had enslaved their fellow human being had a real strong sense of guilt. It was just inbred into them that this is the way that it is. Now, in the year 1808, and I know we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, the United States outlawed the slave trade. In other words, you couldn't, if you wanted a slave after 1808, you couldn't get him or her from Africa or from any other part of the world. The only place you could buy a slave would be in America. And so what's going to happen then is we're going to have a strong desire for the domestic breeding of slaves to create a new crop of slaves. And that leads to what we call genetic selection, where the planters, the farmers, are actually matching up slaves to try to create stronger and more robust, more hardworking slaves. The masters are going to give the women incentives for having as many possible children as she can. A new dress, they would give money, they would give coins to women who had their 15th child, for example. Men that were big, stout men, they were free at night to go from one slave cabin to the next, to the next, to the next, so that they might have as many offspring as they possibly could. And we know as well that there was a lot of what we call miscegenation, which means interactions between the slave owners and the slaves themselves. And so in America, by the end of the 19th century, about a third of people who are designated black are actually mixed race. They're what they called at the time mulattoes. And even after 1808, there's still some people that are running an illegal slave trade. They didn't, even though the federal law said you can't do that, there were quite a few slave traders beyond 1808. Laws pertaining to slaves really kept them in a very subjugated place. They weren't allowed to read, for example. They weren't allowed to associate with certain people. They weren't allowed to go certain places. So it became very, very difficult for slaves to do anything about their condition. However, there were a number of situations where slaves actually revolted. The most famous are the 1739 Stono Rebellion, which was this uprising of slaves. And then in 1831 in Virginia, a slave by the name of Nat Turner had an uprising in which he killed 50 whites. He was captured and executed himself, but there were examples of slaves doing what they could to try to rescue themselves from their bondage and from their imprisonment. We're going to talk a lot more about slavery. I just wanted to give us an overview, the larger context of how slavery got started and how it evolved in early American history.